Have you ever felt a strange sense of familiarity with a place you've never been? Or had a fear of something, like deep water or heights, with no bad experience to explain it? Most of the time, there's a simple reason. Maybe you saw a picture of the place once. Maybe someone told you a scary story about drowning when you were a kid. Our brains are complicated. They pick up things we don't even realize. But what if it's something more? What if that feeling, that fear, isn't yours? What if you inherit it, like you inherited your mother's eyes or your father's hairline? The idea sounds like something from a science fiction movie. We inherit genes, the biological blueprint for our bodies. We don't inherit memories. Memories are made, not born. They're the product of our own unique lives, our experiences, our joys, our pains. They are etched into the pathways of our own brains. That's the classic view. And for a long time, that was the end of the story. But science has a way of finding new chapters in stories we thought were finished. And a new field full of strange and wonderful discoveries is suggesting that the line between you and your ancestors is blurrier than we ever imagined. It suggests that some of their experiences, their traumas, their fears might leave a ghostly echo in your biology. Not a full memory, not a story you can recall, but a feeling, an instinct, a shadow. The question is no longer just a weird thought you might have late at night. It's a real question that scientists are now asking. Can a memory, or at least the ghost of one, be inherited? To even begin to understand this, we have to start with what a memory is. In the simplest terms, a memory is a connection between brain cells or neurons. When you experience something, a specific set of neurons fires together. The smell of baking bread, the sight of your grandmother's kitchen, the feeling of warmth. All these things trigger different neurons. If they happen at the same time, those neurons form a network, a linked-up team. The more you repeat the experience, the stronger that connection becomes. The saying, neurons that fire together, wire together, is pretty much spot on. So, memory is physical. It's a change in the brain's structure. It's your personal history written in the language of cells and chemicals. This is why you can't just plug someone else's memories into your brain like a USB drive. Their brain is wired differently because their life was different. Your memories are yours because you lived them. They are recorded in your unique neural hardware. This makes sense. It's logical. And this is why the idea of inheriting a memory seems so impossible. How could an experience your great-grandmother had in a different country, a long time ago, change the wiring in your brain today? She can't pass down her neural connections. She passed down her DNA, and DNA, we were taught, is just the blueprint. It's the code for building a human, not the story of a human life. The code itself, the sequence of A's, T's, C's, and G's that make up your genes, doesn't change based on experience. A traumatic event doesn't rewrite your genetic code. If it did, we'd be a mess of mutated genes. So, if the code doesn't change, how could the story of an experience be passed on? For a long time, there was no answer. The idea was dismissed as Lamarckism, an old, discredited theory that said an animal could acquire a trait, like a long neck from stretching, and pass it down to its offspring. We know now that's not how it works. You can spend your whole life at the gym, but your kids will still have to do their own push-ups. They don't inherit your muscles, they inherit your genetic potential for building muscle. So, the door seemed closed. Inheritance was about the blueprint, not the life lived with it. But then, things started to get weird. The first hints came not from humans, but from simple creatures in the lab. And they came from a field that was just beginning to explode epigenetics. This is where the story takes a sharp turn. Epigenetics is a fascinating concept. If DNA is the blueprint for a house, epigenetics is the builder's notes written in the margins. The blueprint itself doesn't change, you don't redraw the house, but the notes might say things like, build this wall twice as thick, or don't install the windows in this room, or paint this door red. These notes, these epigenetic marks, are chemical tags that attach to the DNA. They don't change the genetic sequence, but they change how the genes are read. They can switch genes on or off or turn their volume up or down. And here's the crucial part. These epigenetic marks can be influenced by your environment and your experiences. Things like diet, stress, and exposure to toxins can add or remove these chemical tags. Your life experiences can, in a very real way, leave notes on your genetic blueprint. This was a huge discovery. It meant that our experiences could have a direct physical effect on our genes, not by changing the code, but by changing how the code is expressed. This still doesn't get us to inherited memory, though. For that to happen, these epigenetic notes would have to be passed down from parent to child. For a long time, scientists thought this was impossible. The assumption was that during the formation of sperm and eggs, the blueprint gets a clean wipe. All the builder's notes, all the epigenetic tags are erased. This ensures the new embryo starts with a fresh, clean slate. And mostly that's true, but it turns out some of the notes don't get erased. Some of them somehow survive the wipe. They sneak through, pass from one generation to the next. This is where the mice come in. In 2013, two researchers named Brian Dias and Carrie Ressler at Emory University conducted a truly groundbreaking experiment. It sounds a bit cruel, but it was incredibly important. They took a group of male mice and exposed them to the smell of astophanone, a chemical that smells a bit like cherry blossoms or almonds. Every time the mice smelled it, they would receive a mild electric shock to their feet. It didn't take long for the mice to learn. Soon, just the smell of cherry blossoms, with no shock, would make them freeze in fear. They had formed a memory: cherry blossom smell equals pain. Their brains had wired that connection. No surprise there, that's just basic learning, but here is where it gets mind-bending. The researchers then let these mice have babies. These offspring never met their fathers. They never received any electric shocks, and they had never, ever smelled cherry blossoms before. Yet, when these pups were exposed to the smell of acetophenone for the first time, they were jumpy. They were more startled and fearful than pups whose fathers hadn't been through the experiment. It was as if they were born with a suspicion, an innate caution about that specific smell. The researchers went a step further. They looked at the brains of these pups. They had more neurons dedicated to detecting that specific cherry blossom smell than the control mice. Their brains were physically, structurally different. They were pre-wired to be sensitive to a smell that their fathers had learned to fear. The researchers even bred these pups to have their own babies. This third generation, the grand pups, also showed the same heightened sensitivity to the smell of cherry blossoms. The fear, or at least the biological foundation for that fear, had been passed down 2 generations. How? The researchers checked the sperm of the original fathers. They found that the gene responsible for detecting the cherry blossom smell had epigenetic changes. A specific chemical tag had been placed on that gene, likely turning up its volume. This tag was present in their sperm, and it was present in their children and their grandchildren. The father's traumatic experience didn't just create a memory in his brain, it created a biological signal that was carried in his sperm, inherited by his offspring, and which then shaped the way their brains developed. It wasn't a memory in the human sense of a story. The baby mice didn't remember their dad getting shocked. But they inherited a prepackaged fear, an instinct, an echo of their father's trauma. This experiment sent shockwaves through the scientific community. It was tangible, biological proof that an experience could be passed down through generations. And it wasn't just mice. Similar findings started appearing in other animals. In tiny worms called C. elegans, researchers found that an aversion to a specific chemical could be passed down for dozens of generations. There were even older, more controversial experiments with flatworms. In these studies, worms were trained to navigate a maze. Then they were chopped up and fed to untrained worms. The cannibal worms seemed to learn the maze faster, as if the memory was somehow chemical and could be ingested. While these older studies are debated, they all point to the same unsettling and fascinating idea: memory might not be confined entirely to the brain's wiring. So it happens in mice and worms, but what about us? We are infinitely more complex. Our lives are shaped by culture, language, and learning in ways that a mouse's life is not. It's much harder to untangle what is inherited from what is learned. A child of an anxious parent might become anxious themselves. Is that because they inherited an anxiety gene with an epigenetic tag on it, or is it because they grew up in a household where they learned anxious behaviors from their parent? It's the ultimate nature versus nurture question, and the answer is almost always both. Despite the difficulty, there is compelling evidence from human studies that hints at something similar happening in us. One of the most famous examples comes from the Dutch hunger winter. Near the end of World War II, the Nazis created a blockade in the Netherlands, cutting off food supplies. For several months, people were starving, surviving on as little as 500 calories a day. It was a time of intense, widespread trauma and deprivation. Decades later, researchers studied the children who were in their mother's womb during that famine. They found that these individuals, now adults, had higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease compared to their siblings born before or after the famine. Their bodies, it seems, had been epigenetically programmed by their mother's starvation. The message their genes received in the womb was, the world is a place of scarcity. Their metabolism was set to hoard every calorie to store fat efficiently. This was a useful adaptation for a world without enough food. But when these children grew up in a world of normal food availability, that same adaptation became a liability, leading to health problems. The epigenetic marks from the famine were passed down. More surprisingly, researchers even found some of these same metabolic signatures in the grandchildren of the women who survived the hunger winter. The biological memory of starvation had skipped a generation. This isn't a memory of an event, but it's the body remembering a past environment and preparing the next generation for it. The evidence gets even more personal when we look at psychological trauma. Studies have been done on the children of Holocaust survivors. These are large-scale, difficult studies, and they have to be interpreted with great care. But they have found some consistent patterns. The adult children of survivors, on average, show different stress hormone profiles than a control group. Specifically, they tend to have lower levels of cortisol, a key hormone in the stress response. This might sound like a good thing, but it can actually make a person more vulnerable to developing post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). It's as if their stress system is calibrated differently, perhaps as a result of their parents' unimaginable trauma. Again, this isn't inheriting the memory of the concentration camps. The children don't have flashbacks to events they never witnessed. But they may inherit a biological vulnerability, a system that is primed for a high-stress world. They might be born with a different kind of alarm system, one that is more sensitive or that resets differently after a threat has passed. The parent's experience may have left an epigenetic note on the genes that regulate stress, and that note was passed down. It's an emotional inheritance, a predisposition. Think about common phobias. So many people have an intense, irrational fear of snakes or spiders. Why? Many of them have never had a dangerous encounter with one, yet the fear can be crippling. One theory is that these are learned fears, picked up from our parents or from movies. That's certainly true for some. But another idea, one that fits with this new science, is that these fears are ancient, inherited warnings. For our distant ancestors, a deep-seated, instant fear of snakes and spiders was a very good survival mechanism. The hominid who jumped back first was more likely to live and have children. Over thousands of generations, this life-saving aversion could have become embedded in our biology, not as a specific memory, but as a hardwired instinct. It's a collective memory passed down not as a story, but as a reflex. So, if we do inherit memories, what kind are they? It's crucial to be clear about this. We are not talking about what psychologists call explicit memory. Explicit memories are the conscious ones, remembering your first day of school, what you had for breakfast, or the capital of France. These are rich, detailed narrative memories. There is absolutely no evidence that these kinds of memories can be inherited. You will not be born suddenly knowing your grandfather's war stories or your grandmother's secret recipe for pasta sauce. Those memories live in the specific connections of their brains and die with them. What we might be inheriting is a form of implicit memory. Implicit memory is unconscious. It's the stuff you know how to do without thinking about it. Riding a bike is an implicit memory. So, our emotional responses, the feeling of dread you get when you hear a certain sound, or the sense of comfort from a particular smell, these are not stories, they are feelings and reactions. The inherited memories we see in the mice and that are hinted at in human studies are of this type. They are not memories of an event, but rather the emotional and physiological consequence of an event. A baby mouse inherits a fear of a smell, not the story of the shock. The grandchild of a famine survivor inherits a thrifty metabolism, not a memory of hunger pangs. The child of a trauma survivor may inherit a hypersensitive stress system, not the images of the trauma itself. It's more like inheriting a musical theme than a whole song. You inherit the feeling of dread, the sense of unease, the biological readiness for a threat that your ancestor faced. It's a behavioral echo, a ghost in your genes. Of course, this whole idea is still very new, and it's not without its critics. Science is a slow, careful process. One amazing mouse study doesn't change everything overnight. There are a lot of unanswered questions and valid reasons for skepticism. One of the biggest challenges is the mechanism. Scientists are still figuring out exactly how these epigenetic tags manage to survive the big wipe during reproduction. It seems some genes are just better at hiding their tags and sneaking them through to the next generation. But which ones and why? We don't fully know yet. Another huge problem, especially with human studies, is separating inheritance from environment. Let's go back to the child of a trauma survivor. That parent, because of their experience, might raise their child differently. They might be more overprotective or more anxious or have trouble forming secure attachments. The child's anxiety could be a direct result of that upbringing, of the environment they grew up in. It would have nothing to do with epigenetics, it would be a learned behavior. Teasing apart these two influences in the inherited biology and the lived environment is incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible. They are both happening at the same time, weaving together to create the person. Some scientists also argue that the effects seen in these studies are real, but they might not be as widespread or as powerful as they seem. The human experience is incredibly complex. A single epigenetic tag passed down from your great-grandfather is just one tiny influence among millions. You also have your own life, your own experiences, which are constantly adding and erasing their own epigenetic notes on your DNA. You are not a prisoner of your ancestors' past. Your own choices, your diet, your stress levels, your relationships, all of these things are actively shaping your biology every day. So, where does that leave us? The evidence suggests that yes, in a way, a memory can be inherited. But we have to be very specific about what that means. It's not the inheritance of a story, a picture, a narrative. It is the inheritance of a biological predisposition, an emotional echo, a physical readiness for a world that your ancestors experienced. It's the inheritance of a fear, a stress response, or a metabolic setting. This idea is profound. It changes how we think about ourselves. We are not blank slates at birth. We arrive in the world carrying more than just the genetic blueprint for our bodies. We carry the faint biological whispers of our ancestors' lives. Their famines, their fears, their traumas, these things might be part of our inheritance, shaping our instincts and our health in subtle ways we are just beginning to understand. This doesn't mean we are doomed to repeat the past or that our lives are predetermined by our great-grandparents' suffering. Far from it. In fact, it might be the opposite. Understanding that these vulnerabilities might be biological, not a personal failing, can be empowering. If you have an anxiety that seems to come from nowhere, maybe it's not just in your head. Maybe it's an echo from the past. And knowing that can be the first step to dealing with it in the present. The epigenetics is a two-way street. Just as negative experiences can leave a mark, positive experiences, good nutrition, a stable environment, therapy can also change our epigenetic tags for the better. We are not just passive recipients of our history, we are active participants in our own biology. This field of study is still in its infancy. It's a blurry, exciting, and sometimes controversial frontier of science. We are just starting to decode the messages passed down to us, but what's clear is that the simple story we were told about inheritance is not the whole story. We are connected to our past and to the people who came before us in ways that are deeper and more biological than we ever knew. We carry their history not just in family stories or old photographs, but in the very chemistry of our cells. The lives they lived may have left faint marks on our blueprint, setting the stage for the life we live today. It's a humbling and powerful thought. We are, in a very real sense, the living memory of our ancestors.